55 to 58 megatons. 48.33 times the force of Fat Man, the Tsar Bomb sent a very clear message. Three years later, Russia would win its second gold medal for men's hockey. This was a far cry from Canada's 6, but by 1988, Russia would have 7 gold medals, while Canada would remain at 6. The Soviets had developed their own style of hockey that had started to rival the Canadian form.
It's the biggest that has ever happened in the history of life.
And with the Canadians not being able to have their professional hockey players in the Olympics, Russia had come to dominate. The amateur Canadian hockey players had a hard time keeping up with players like Tetriak and Kharlamov. Tetriak is considered one of the best players of all time and possibly the best goalie to ever come out of Russia. And Kharlamov is the Russian version of Maurice Richard or Wayne Gretzky, depending on your knowledge of hockey. In December of 1971, diplomat Gary Smith at the Canadian Embassy in Moscow was reading a newspaper. While reading this newspaper, he saw an article saying that the Russian national hockey team was looking for a bigger challenge. Now, luckily, Gary was in charge of sports and cultural exchanges and started dreaming up an exchange between Canada's foot and Russia's ass on the hockey rink. Attempting to put some more cold in the Cold War, Gary met with the newspaper's editor, Boris Fedosov. Initially, and then he remembered that he's a politician and that's usually not how you set up international games, so he then later talked to the Kremlin. More importantly, this guy, I'm not even going to attempt to say that name, who was the leader of Soviet hockey in Russia, and they met in January. After this meeting, Canadian ambassador Robert Ford passed the metaphorical puck to Ottawa to get the ball rolling. Hockey Canada, which if you're not in Canada is the organization in Canada that deals with hockey, was put in charge of coming up with the rules for the series because the normal street rules of meeting at midnight and playing for pinks wouldn't really work with the time zone difference. By the time March rolled around, Canada had proposed a round robin that would include Sweden and Czechoslovakia to be held in 1971. Now, it wasn't until April of 1972, when both teams were at the World Hockey Championships in Prague, they sat down and signed the letter of agreement on the 18th of April. The terms were as followed. 4 games we played in Canada at the beginning of September, followed by 4 games in Moscow at the end of September. Russia also announced that they'd be playing 2 games in Sweden in between the 2 sets of 4 to celebrate the anniversary of hockey in Sweden. Canada also wanted to play 2 games in Czechoslovakia to repay the fact that the Slovakian team had played a couple games in Canada.
Corner, and a penalty coming to Canada as Bergman.
Welcome, folks, to the first ever Summit Series. I'm Sean Derry, and I'm here with Faye Roraro. Faye, bring us into the game. Well, Sean, these boys had some confidence. The Canadians had more confidence than Stevie Wonder on Tinder. Well, Faye, why wouldn't they? They had Ken Dryden, a player that would play 9 years in the show and win 7 Stanley Cups. What an impressive showcase. His first one in 1971 and his second one in 1973. They also had Bobby Clarke, who would go on to win the Stanley Cup twice with the Philadelphia Flyers, once in 74 and once in 75. Phil and Tony Esposito also both had Stanley Cups, and I mean I can already tell I'm losing some of you. Right off the bat, the confidence showed itself when during the ceremonial face-off that has no importance in the game, Phil Esposito won and the crowd went nuts. The Soviets would also not release their starting lineup, even though it's the opposite order, because, they were the visitors. Well, originally the Canadians wanted to put the Rangers line out first to face off against Kharlamov, but the Soviets did not put Kharlamov out first, so they switched it out and put out Phil Esposito. This move was made so last minute, it was announced coming back from the first commercial break. But it paid off, as Phil Esposito scored in the first 30 minutes of the game. Now, if we did a play-by-play for all these games, we'd be here for at least 16 hours. All the games are up on YouTube for free. I'll put a link down below for a playlist for them all, so we're just gonna power through these boys. So let's see how the Canadians did. They lost. Shit.
Hard for that first goal. A long shot left wide. Tetriak didn't even see it from the corner.
So upon some reflection, some changes were made and some players were benched, including Ken Dryden. Tony Esposito took over for Ken in net, which I guess is fair with 7 goals. That's pretty rough. And I feel I should also mention Vic Hadfield, who was from Oakville, which is in the GTA or Greater Toronto area, who felt that him being scratched was insulting and embarrassing, which it 100% was for him. So Canada looked back on Game 1 and saw what made the Russians so good. Now the Russian style of hockey was built upon the idea that you're only as strong as your weakest link. So they were spread out more and they didn't really believe in star players, even though they had to. Now the Canadians were doing a play that I like to call the shooting gallery, where they slow down and set up passes, where the Russian players never seemed to sit still. Now in Game 1, the Canadians would try to beat the Russians at their own game, going off speed. But for Game 2, they would go back to what they're best at, and that's playing a physical game of hockey. Now the first period was scoreless, but the Canadians pounded the Russians with body checks, grinding them down. Phil Esposito opened the scoring again, leading Canada to a 4-1 victory, tying the series at 1-1. Now the Russians tried an age-old hockey tradition and started whining to the refs. But you can whine as much as you want, and that ain't gonna change the score. Isn't that right, Toronto? Oh what? Prove me wrong! Prove me wrong! Now the Soviets blamed the loss of Game 2 with them straying too close to the Canadian form of hockey. Which, I mean, does stink when you are playing hockey, eh? Now, thanks to Game 2, the crowd was electric. When they were doing the opening lineup, when they got to Bobby Clark, the crowd went so crazy that they had to stop the freaking lineup because people wouldn't stop cheering. Now, the Canadians opened the scoring against the Soviets with Parise getting the first goal, but the short-handed Soviets replied back real quick with Petrov. Now, by the end of the first period, the Canadians led 2-1. But by the end of the whole game, the game was tied 4-4 because apparently we used to not think winners in sports were important. But listen, don't worry, there's 8 games in this, so let's just get on getting. It'll be fine, it's going to work itself out.
Are 5, Canada 2.
2 Canadian penalties right off the bat led to 2 shorthanded goals. God damn it. The Soviets did reflect a puck into their own net. Nice. But the Soviets still won 5-3. Not so nice. Well, maybe now they'll bring Ken Dryden back in net. What? They already did? God!
The net, trying to get an opening, goes back.
Hail Stalin, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful land of Russia. Now, while you're in town, why not stop by some of our great landmarks, like the St. Basil, where you can get a lovely linguine pesto, or the Kremlin, which I was surprised to find out was not the St. Basil, the Red Square, or there is also the Hermitage, or the Hermitage, or you can just pull a Vic Hadfield or a Rick Martin and just leave. Thanks to not a lot of practices and the different size of rink, both players just decided to go home to focus on the coming NHL season. The nets were also apparently tighter, and a lot of players were worried that when they took slap shots and it hit the back of the net, that it would ricochet out and hit them, which is a strange thing to be worried about. Now, in the pre-game presentation, the Russians gave the Canadians red and white flowers, to which Philly, which was super nice, until Phil Esposito fell and crushed his flowers. Way to go, Philly boy! Now let's go down to the ice where we got Hoster Fewitt. Hoster, what's going on down there?
Shut! Okay. Get the hand talker, dude. It's fucking not hand related. Thanks, John and Faye. Shit's getting pretty wild out here, but luckily, there's no sign of Ken Dryden.
You Hoster.
No, John. You.
Now the Canadians started off the game strong, getting up 3-0, but sadly the game would end 5-4 in the favor of the USSR. Despite this, the 3,000 Canadian fans at the game all sang "O Canada" as the Canadian team left off to try to boost up their spirits for the next game. Now the Canadians had to win all 3 remaining games to win the series, and Gary Perrault thought this was so impossible that he left and joined Vic and Rick.
Winning, he passes out to Raglan.
I've made a severe and continuous lapse in my judgment.
Now, they did bring Ken Dryden back in net, which looking at it is a bit of a weird decision, seeing that not even just in the series, but in his whole career, Ken Dryden never won against the Russians. The first period remained scoreless, but the Soviets in the second period would draw first blood. Now, Bobby Clark was told by assistant coach John Ferguson, "I think he needs a tap on the ankle," when referring to Kharlamov. Bobby Clark then intentionally slashed Kharlamov, the Russian version of Gretzky, taking him out of the game. Following this, in 1.5 minutes, Canada would score 3 goals, bringing them to a 3-2 victory. Following this game, despite the whole Bobby Clark thing, Canadians have complained about the German refs, as they had 31 penalty minutes compared to the Soviets' 4. The refs even dropped the puck while Phil Esposito was conversing with a teammate, leading to a direct goal.
It's a 1-1 tie as the puck is shot out at center ice.
Okay, Game 7. So both German refs were replaced. One from a ref from Czechoslovakia and the other ref from Sweden. And this seemed to work. Phil Esposito, as always, opened up the scoring. In the third period, a scruff broke out between the two teams, and Mikhailov, for, guess what, the Russians, kicked Bergman twice. Now, luckily, the Canadians were able to hold out and won the game 4-3, getting a little bit closer to regaining their confidence and their dignity. Now, for the final game, the Soviets wanted the German refs back, but Canada was threatened to be pulled out of the game, so a compromise was made. Now, the Canadians then offered the Russians a totem pole as a gift, but the Soviets refused as the relationship between the two countries had broken down. So the Canadians said that they would put the totem pole in the middle of the ice, and if the Russians wouldn't take it, then they'd have to skate around it the whole game. The Russians finally took it, but then canceled the pre-game presentation, but it was later put back in place by the insistence of the Canadians. Now in Canada, this game became such a big deal that a lot of people got time off work and school. And if you weren't given the time off work and school, you were watching the game while at work or at school. Now right off the bat, Canada got 2 questionable penalties, leading to the Soviets drawing first blood. Now emotions boiled over, as Parise was mistakenly called for an interference penalty. It caused a delay of game, as well as Canada's coach, Sandin, throwing the chair on the ice. Now after this, Parise almost attacked Kampala, resulting in a penalty, as well as a lot of people believe the refs finally calling a fair game. Now after Parise's penalty for the near attack, Canada would go into power play, resulting in Phil Esposito getting his 6th goal of the game and tying it 1-1. After the first period, the game was 2-2, and they exchanged power plays back and forth, resulting into them going to the final minutes of the game at 5-5, all tied up. 2 Soviets mishandled the puck behind the net, resulting in Phil Esposito taking a shot at Tetriak. Now Hedinson, who had fallen down behind the net, had gotten up and had collected the rebound and shot it back at Tetriak. The rebound was stopped, but with Tetriak down, Hedinson took another shot and buried the puck behind him. Now with only 34 seconds left, Canada had won the Summit Series, and this goal is so embedded into Canadian culture that is now mostly known as just the goal. The Canadians arrived back in Canada on October 1st and were mobbed by a crowd of 100,000 people at the La Montreal airport before continuing on to Toronto, where they were mobbed by 80,000 people. Canadians were pumped. After years of having the crown taken away from us, falling behind in the beginning of the series, and the horrible mistreatment of our players and their wives while in Russia, having to have originally stayed in different hotels from their wives, and their wives be giving subpar food, as well as all their practices being cut short, this really did feel like an underdog story. Now yes, like I said earlier, Russia would go on to win 7 gold medals by 1988. But from this point in 1972, Canada could say with confidence, the only reason we were losing at the Olympics was because our star players were not allowed to play. So there, now you know a little bit more about hockey history. Congratulations, this will never be useful. You can go now.